Frank stood behind the cash register, his eyes scanning the busy supermarket with a mix of disdain and boredom. As customers approached his checkout lane, he greeted them with curt nods and minimal conversation. His demeanor was cold and uninviting, a stark contrast to the cheerful atmosphere of the small-town grocery store. An elderly woman fumbled with her wallet, struggling to count out the correct change. Frank's impatience grew visibly. "Any day now, ma'am," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. The woman's hands trembled as she apologized, her face flushing with embarrassment. Frank rolled his eyes, making no effort to hide his contempt. As the day wore on, Frank's snippy comments and condescending attitude continued to grate on customers. He seemed to take particular pleasure in belittling those who didn't meet his standards of appearance or efficiency. His coworkers exchanged worried glances, but no one dared to confront him. The atmosphere in the store shifted when Anthony walked in. Tall, well-dressed, and exuding confidence, he drew admiring glances from other shoppers. His tailored suit and polished shoes spoke of success and sophistication. As Anthony made his way through the aisles, selecting items with care, Frank watched him with narrowed eyes. When Anthony approached Frank's checkout, the cashier's demeanor changed instantly. His usual sneer deepened, and a look of disgust flashed across his face. "I can help the next customer over here," Frank called out, deliberately ignoring Anthony and waving forward a white woman standing behind him. Anthony, taken aback, spoke up. "Excuse me, but I believe I was next in line." His voice was calm but firm, drawing the attention of nearby shoppers. Frank's response was immediate and harsh. "Listen, buddy, I decide who I serve here. Why don't you try the store down the street? They might be more accommodating to your kind." The racist undertone in Frank's words was unmistakable. A hush fell over the immediate area as customers registered what was happening. Some gasped in shock, while others began to mutter in disapproval. Anthony stood his ground, his expression a mix of hurt and disbelief. As the tension mounted, more people began to take notice of the confrontation unfolding at Frank's register. The murmurs of discontent grew louder, and several customers shook their heads in disgust at Frank's behavior. Yet, the cashier remained defiant, his prejudice on full display for all to see. Lisa, a young mother in her early 30s, stood in line with her 8-year-old son, Tommy. They watched the scene unfold between Frank and Anthony with growing concern. Lisa's grip on Tommy's hand tightened as she overheard Frank's racist remarks. "Mom, why is that man being so mean?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with confusion. Lisa knelt down, meeting her son's eyes. "Sometimes, people judge others unfairly based on how they look. It's wrong, and we need to stand up against it," she explained quietly. Determined to set an example for her son, Lisa stepped forward. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "That gentleman was next in line. There's no reason he shouldn't be served." Her intervention drew surprised looks from nearby customers, some nodding in agreement. Frank glared at Lisa, his face reddening with anger. "Ma'am, this isn't your business. Please wait your turn," he snapped. But Lisa stood her ground, pulling Tommy close. "It is my business when someone is being treated unfairly. We're all equal here." John, an elderly man with a cane who had been silently observing, decided to join the fray. He shuffled forward, shaking his head disapprovingly at Frank. "Young man," he addressed the cashier, his voice gravelly but firm, "I've seen a lot in my years, and this kind of behavior is unacceptable. You should be ashamed." The tension in the air grew thicker as more customers began to voice their support for Anthony. Some pulled out their phones, recording the incident. Others called for a manager, their voices rising in a chorus of disapproval. Amidst the growing chaos, the automatic doors at the front of the store slid open. Stephen, the supermarket's owner, walked in, immediately sensing the unusual atmosphere. He noticed the cluster of people around Frank's register, the raised voices, and the looks of concern on his employees' faces. Frowning, Stephen made his way towards the commotion. As he approached, he could hear the tail end of Frank's latest inflammatory comment. The owner's expression hardened, realizing the severity of the situation unfolding in his store. Stephen pushed through the crowd of onlookers, his face a mask of concern. "What's going on here?" he demanded, looking from Frank to Anthony and then to the gathering of upset customers. Frank, caught off guard by his boss's sudden appearance, attempted to regain composure. "Sir, I was just explaining to this customer that we reserve the right to refuse service," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness. Stephen's eyes narrowed. "Is that so? And on what grounds are you refusing service?" he asked, his tone sharp. Before Frank could respond, Anthony stepped forward. His demeanor remained calm, but there was a steely glint in his eyes. "Mr. Stevens, I presume," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Anthony Pearson. We spoke on the phone last week about my investment in your chain." A hush fell over the crowd as the implications of Anthony's words sank in. Stephen's eyes widened in recognition, then quickly narrowed as he turned to Frank. The cashier's face had drained of color, his earlier bravado evaporating. "Mr. Pearson, I had no idea. Please accept my deepest apologies for this situation," Stephen stammered, shaking Anthony's hand vigorously. He then addressed the gathered crowd, his voice carrying across the store. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disturbance. What you've witnessed here today is completely unacceptable and goes against everything our store stands for." Frank, realizing the gravity of his mistake, attempted to backpedal. "Sir, I didn't know. I was just trying to—" Stephen cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Enough, Frank. We'll discuss this later." He turned back to the customers, his expression serious. "I believe we need to have an open discussion about what's happened here today. Prejudice and discrimination have no place in our community or in this store." The customers murmured in agreement, many nodding approvingly at Stephen's words. Some began to gather closer, eager to hear more. "If you'll indulge me," Stephen continued, "I'd like to take a moment to address this issue head-on. It's clear that we have work to do, and it starts right here, right now." As Stephen prepared to speak, the atmosphere in the store shifted. The earlier tension began to give way to a sense of anticipation. Customers exchanged glances, some curious, others supportive, as they waited to hear what the owner had to say about the incident they had just witnessed. Stephen took a deep breath, surveying the crowd of customers gathered around him. "Folks, what we've witnessed today is a stark reminder that prejudice and discrimination are still very real issues in our community," he began, his voice firm and clear. "But it's also an opportunity for us to come together and reaffirm our commitment to diversity and respect." He gestured towards Anthony. "Success, intelligence, and human worth aren't determined by the color of one's skin. Mr. Pearson here is a shining example of that. He's not just a customer, but a respected businessman and investor in our company." The customers listened intently, many nodding in agreement. Stephen continued, "Our strength as a community comes from our diversity. Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, gender, age, or background." Anthony, moved by Stephen's words, stepped forward. "If I may," he said, addressing the crowd, "I've faced discrimination throughout my life, but I've never let it define me or limit my aspirations." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces watching him. "I worked hard to get where I am today, overcoming obstacles that many of you might never have to face." As Anthony spoke, the atmosphere in the store changed. Customers leaned in, captivated by his story. He shared anecdotes of his journey from a working-class background to becoming a successful investor, detailing the prejudices he encountered along the way. "But I didn't succeed despite being black," Anthony concluded. "I succeeded as a human being, with all the complexities and capabilities that entails. And that's something we all share, regardless of our differences." Inspired by Anthony's openness, other customers began to share their own experiences. An elderly woman recounted facing sexism in her career, while a young man with a disability spoke about the daily challenges he encountered. As more stories were shared, a sense of solidarity began to grow among the gathered crowd. People who had been strangers moments before now nodded in understanding, offering words of support to one another. Frank, still standing behind his register, listened to these stories with a mix of shame and dawning realization. The diversity of experiences being shared challenged his narrow worldview, forcing him to confront the harm his prejudices had caused. As the impromptu sharing session continued, Lisa, the young mother who had initially spoken up, stepped forward with her son Tommy. "Mr. Pearson," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "I want to thank you for your bravery today. Your response to this situation has been an invaluable lesson for my son about dignity and strength in the face of prejudice." Tommy, encouraged by his mother, spoke up, "You're really cool, Mr. Pearson. When I grow up, I want to be strong like you." Anthony smiled warmly at the boy. "Thank you, Tommy. Remember, true strength comes from treating everyone with kindness and respect, no matter who they are." This interaction seemed to break the last of the tension in the store. Customers who had been silent observers now approached Anthony, offering words of support and apology for what he had experienced. The atmosphere had transformed from one of conflict to one of unity and understanding. Amidst this change, Frank stood isolated behind his register, the weight of his actions bearing down on him. Customers who had previously been in his line now deliberately avoided his gaze, some even moving to other registers. Stephen, sensing the shift in mood, seized the moment. "Folks, what we've witnessed here today is both troubling and inspiring. It's clear that we need to do more to combat prejudice and promote inclusivity, not just in this store, but in our community as a whole." He paused, looking around at the nodding faces before continuing, "That's why, effective immediately, I'm announcing the creation of a diversity and inclusion program for our entire chain of stores. We'll be providing training for all our employees and creating opportunities for community engagement on these important issues." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause from the gathered crowd. Many customers voiced their approval, some even offering to volunteer their time and expertise to help with the initiative. Anthony stepped forward once more. "Mr. Stevens, I commend your quick action. As an investor in this company, I fully support this initiative and would be honored to contribute my experiences and resources to make it a success." The store, which had earlier been a scene of conflict, was now filled with a sense of purpose and unity. Customers began to discuss among themselves how they could contribute to making their community more inclusive and welcoming to all. As the crowd dispersed and customers returned to their shopping, Frank remained at his register, visibly shaken. The weight of his actions and the subsequent events left him feeling isolated and ashamed. He watched as people deliberately avoided his line, choosing longer queues at other registers instead. For the first time, Frank began to comprehend the impact of his words and behavior. The stories he had heard, the unity he had witnessed among the diverse group of customers, all challenged the prejudices he had held for so long. A sense of unease grew within him as he realized the harm he had caused not just today, but potentially throughout his time working at the store. After several minutes of internal struggle, Frank made a decision. With trembling hands, he closed his register and stepped out from behind the counter. He approached Anthony, who was still engaged in conversation with Stephen and some customers. "Mr. Pearson," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. The group fell silent, all eyes turning to the cashier. I want to apologize for my behavior. It was inexcusable." Anthony regarded Frank with a steady gaze, his expression unreadable. Frank continued, his words coming out in a rush. I didn't realize. Your words and everyone else's stories, they've made me see things differently. I know it doesn't excuse what I did, but I want you to know that I'm truly sorry." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Finally, Anthony spoke, his voice firm but not unkind. "Thank you for your apology, Frank. You're right, it doesn't excuse your actions. But recognizing your mistake is the first step towards change." Anthony paused, considering his next words carefully. "I accept your apology, but I hope you understand that it's not enough to simply say sorry. Real change requires commitment and effort. Are you willing to learn and do better?" Frank nodded, a mix of relief and determination on his face. "Yes, sir. I want to learn. I want to be better." Stephen, who had been watching the exchange, stepped forward. "Frank, I appreciate you taking this step, but understand that there will be consequences for your actions today. We'll discuss this further in private. For now, I want you to take the rest of the day off and reflect on everything that's happened." Frank nodded again, accepting the decision. As he turned to leave, he found himself face to face with the diverse group of customers he had earlier dismissed or insulted. The path to redemption, he realized, would be long and challenging. In the days following the incident, the supermarket buzzed with activity as Stephen's new diversity program took shape. Posters promoting inclusivity appeared on walls, and informational pamphlets were available at every checkout. Customers engaged in discussions about the initiative, many expressing their support and offering suggestions. Frank returned to work, but his role had changed. Stephen had assigned him to participate in intensive diversity training sessions, led by experts in the field. These sessions forced Frank to confront his biases head-on and learn about the experiences of marginalized groups. During one particularly challenging session, Frank found himself struggling with the concepts being presented. The facilitator was discussing systemic racism, a topic that made Frank uncomfortable. He raised his hand, his voice hesitant. "I understand that racism is wrong, but isn't this all a bit exaggerated? I mean, everyone has equal opportunities these days, right?" The room fell silent. Other participants, a mix of employees from various stores in the chain, turned to look at him. The facilitator, however, smiled patiently. "That's a common misconception, Frank. Let's break this down and look at some real-world examples." What followed was an eye-opening discussion that left Frank reeling. Statistics, personal anecdotes, and historical context all painted a picture he had never fully seen before. By the end of the session, Frank sat in stunned silence, processing the new information. As he was leaving, still deep in thought, he nearly bumped into Stephen. The owner had been observing the training sessions, gauging their effectiveness. "How are you holding up, Frank?" Stephen asked, noting the cashier's troubled expression. Frank sighed heavily. "It's a lot to take in, sir. I'm realizing how much I didn't know, how much I've been blind to. It's not easy facing up to these things." Stephen nodded understandingly. "Change rarely is easy, Frank, but it's necessary. I'm glad to see you're taking this seriously." He paused, then added, "Keep at it. Your willingness to learn and grow is a vital part of making our store and our community a better place for everyone." As Stephen walked away, Frank felt a mix of emotions: shame for his past behavior, determination to do better, and a glimmer of hope for the future. He realized that this journey of understanding and change was just beginning, but for the first time, he was committed to seeing it through. As weeks passed, the supermarket transformed into a hub of learning and open dialogue. Customers and employees alike engaged in conversations about diversity and inclusion, often sparked by the educational materials now prominently displayed throughout the store. Anthony, true to his word, became an active participant in the diversity initiative. He visited the store regularly, not just as an investor, but as a mentor and speaker. His presence served as a powerful reminder of the incident that had catalyzed these changes, and his willingness to engage with both staff and customers set an example of forgiveness and progress. During one of his visits, Anthony noticed Frank restocking shelves, head down and focused on his task. He approached the cashier, who looked up nervously. "Mr. Pearson," Frank said, his voice a mix of respect and apprehension. "Frank," Anthony nodded. "I've heard you've been actively participating in the training sessions. How are you finding them?" Frank paused, considering his words carefully. "They're challenging, sir, but eye-opening. I'm learning things I never knew, seeing perspectives I never considered before. It's not always comfortable, but I know it's important." Anthony smiled slightly. "Growth rarely happens in our comfort zones, Frank. I'm glad to hear you're taking it seriously." As they talked, a customer approached, an elderly woman Frank recognized as a regular. Instead of avoiding him as many still did, she smiled warmly. "Frank, dear, I overheard you talking about the diversity sessions. I just wanted to say how proud I am to see you making an effort. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong and try to change." Frank felt a lump in his throat, touched by the unexpected support. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm trying my best." As the woman moved on, Anthony placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "You see, Frank, this is how change happens. One conversation, one realization at a time. Keep it up." Frank nodded, a newfound determination in his eyes. As he watched Anthony walk away, He realized that the supermarket had become more than just his workplace. It was now a place of personal growth, a community where he was learning to see beyond his prejudices and treat everyone with the respect they deserved. The journey was far from over, but Frank felt, for the first time, that he was on the right path. 3 months after the incident, the supermarket hosted a community event celebrating diversity and inclusion. The store was decorated with colorful banners and posters showcasing different cultures and promoting unity. Local leaders, customers, and employees gathered to mark the progress made and discuss future initiatives. Stephen took the stage, beaming with pride. "Welcome, everyone. Today, we're not just celebrating the changes we've made in our store, but the ripple effect it's had in our community. I'm proud to announce that our diversity program has been adopted by the local Chamber of Commerce as a model for other businesses." The crowd applauded enthusiastically. Stephen continued, "And now, I'd like to invite the man who inspired this change, Mr. Anthony Pearson, to say a few words." Anthony stepped up to the microphone, his presence commanding respect. "Thank you, Stephen. When I walked into this store 3 months ago, I never imagined the impact that day would have. What started as an ugly incident has transformed into a beautiful movement of understanding and growth." He paused, scanning the crowd. "I see faces here today from all walks of life, united in the belief that we are stronger together. This is what community looks like. This is what progress looks like." As Anthony spoke, Frank stood at the back of the crowd, listening intently. He had volunteered to work during the event, wanting to be present but still feeling unsure of his place in the celebration. Anthony's words resonated deeply with him, reinforcing the lessons he'd learned over the past months. After the speeches, as people mingled and enjoyed refreshments, Frank approached Anthony. "Mr. Pearson," he said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you again. Your forgiveness and the example you've set, it's changed my life." Anthony shook Frank's hand firmly. "Frank, I'm glad to hear that. But remember, the real test is how we carry these lessons forward. How will you use what you've learned to make a difference?" Frank nodded solemnly. "I've been thinking about that. I've asked Stephen if I could be part of the team that takes this program to other stores. I want to share my story, help others learn from my mistakes." Anthony smiled, genuine approval in his eyes. "That's excellent, Frank. Your journey can be a powerful teaching tool." As the event wound down, the atmosphere in the store was one of hope and unity. The supermarket had become more than just a place to buy groceries. It was now a symbol of what could be achieved when a community came together to confront prejudice and promote understanding. 6 months after the initial incident, the supermarket had become a model of inclusivity in the community. On a busy Saturday morning, Frank was operating his register, greeting customers with genuine warmth regardless of their appearance or background. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the entrance. A middle-aged man was loudly berating a young woman wearing a hijab, his voice carrying across the store. "Go back to your own country," he shouted, drawing shocked gasps from nearby customers. Frank's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the ugliness of the scene, a mirror of his own past behavior. Without hesitation, he closed his register and strode towards the conflict. "Sir," Frank said firmly, positioning himself between the man and the woman, "that kind of language and behavior is not welcome here. Please leave the store immediately." The man turned his anger towards Frank. "Who do you think you are? You can't tell me what to do." Frank stood his ground, his voice steady. "I'm an employee of this store, and we have a strict policy against discrimination and hate speech. What you're doing is wrong, and it stops now." Other customers, including Anthony, who happened to be shopping, gathered around in support. The racist man, realizing he was outnumbered, stormed out of the store, muttering under his breath. Frank turned to the woman in the hijab. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry you had to experience that. Please, let me know if there's anything we can do to help." The woman, though shaken, managed a small smile. "Thank you for standing up for me. It means more than you know." As the crowd dispersed, Anthony approached Frank, a look of pride on his face. "Well done, Frank. You've come a long way." Frank nodded, a mix of emotions crossing his face. "I just did what was right, what I should have done from the beginning." Later that day, Stephen called Frank into his office. "I heard about what happened this morning," he said. "Your actions exemplify everything we've been working towards. I'd like to offer you a promotion to assistant manager with a focus on our diversity and inclusion initiatives." Frank was stunned. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored. I'll do my best to live up to this responsibility." As Frank left the office, he passed the wall where the store's mission statement hung. The words respect, diversity, community caught his eye. For the first time, he felt he truly embodied those values. The supermarket, once the site of an ugly display of prejudice, had become a beacon of hope and change. And Frank, once the face of that prejudice, was now at the forefront of the store's transformation, a living testament to the power of education, empathy, and personal growth.